Hey everyone, welcome to yet another episode of my video series on Joshua Bloch's Effective Java. Now, like every other content creator, YouTuber, whatever you may call it, we are no fans of lawnmowers, leaf blowers, any of that. And unfortunately, despite living in a very quiet neighborhood, there's someone mowing the lawn. So I apologize if the background noise is gonna ruin the quality of this video, but in the editing process, I'll try to filter it out and kind of make it a bit more listenable. In any case, getting to this, today we're going to cover a pretty simple item, to be honest. It's item 12, which is always override ToString. So if you have been following along in item 11, we did always override hash code when you override equals, and essentially I've been going through all the items in Joshua Bloch's book. But as per usual, before we get to the item itself, I want to get through the proviso. So without further ado, let's get started. This is not a tutorial. I am not a teacher or an expert, so whatever I say in this video, please do your own research. Ask ChatGPT for God's sake, because ChatGPT is probably going to give a better explanation than I do. I feel like a lot of these tutorials are eventually going to be redundant or obsolete. Really, the AI does a much better job in explaining these concepts than myself at least can ever do. Nonetheless, I'm really doing these videos more for myself than the general public, rather selfishly, because in some sense explaining things, it allows one to learn things much better and it kind of settles more in your mind. Sorry, I'm talking too much. So yeah, as I said, this is not a tutorial, I'm not a teacher, not an expert. Please do your own research. I've always used the analogy, this is similar to the blind, leading the blind. I'm as equally or perhaps even more blind as you are when it comes to the concepts highlighted in this book, but also computer science in general. This is a exploratory disquisition. That's simply what it is. I'm exploring something, and while I'm exploring these concepts, I think out loud, essentially. I will inevitably make mistakes, so please do be kind enough to point them out, more for the sake of the other viewers than myself, but for myself too, because I don't want to spread any false information. And all the code, given that this is a programming tutorial series, not a tutorial, I just said it's not a tutorial. Given that this is a programming video series, all the code will be available on GitHub. Okay, enough of that, let's get started. So, as I said, item number 12 is always override ToString. It's not an overtly complicated item. The concepts are quite straightforward. Nonetheless, it's important to grok what Joshua Bloch has delineated in this item to write better code, essentially, because the ToString method is obviously common to the object class, and every class that you write will have a ToString method by default. So to get the basics out of the way, what the ToString method does is that it simply gives a string representation of your object, whatever it may be. And which is why it is the object superclass, which is the superclass of every other class in Java, has the ToString method. And if you look at the ToString method, what you'll see is that it returns the class name followed by the unsigned hexadecimal representation of the hash code. So this is what the ToString method by default does. But unfortunately, for most use cases, or essentially all use cases, this doesn't suffice. The reason being, the Java contract, so I'm reading out the book, the Java contract for ToString says that the return string should be a concise but informative representation that is easy for a person to read. Now, what this returns, so essentially, I'll show you an example soon, but the important thing, this could be concise, but the important thing is that it should be easy to read and it should be something meaningful. So if we take a look at this phone number class, which is what Joshua Bloch has given in his demo, by default, if we don't override the ToString method, and here in line number 59, if I've created an object of phone number, an object called Jenny, and given it the area code, the prefix, and the line num, and if I print this object, you'll see what you get is the name of the class with its package location, and then an unsigned, the hexadecimal pretty much. This, for a user, for a human being, is not meaningful enough, especially given that this class is supposed to represent a phone number in a given format. So what we can do is we can override the ToString method, and if we do override it, you'll see here we're setting it to a particular format using the significant fields of this class, which are these three fields. And then after overriding it, oops, that's the wrong one. After overriding it, if we rerun this code, you'll see what's returned now is something a bit more meaningful. It's in fact an actual phone number with the given values. So that's why it's advised always to override the ToString method, because majority of classes we need to represent them in a meaningful way. So Joshua Bloch states, the ToString contract goes on to say, it is recommended that all subclasses override this method. Good advice indeed. Now, of course, if you're a programmer and not particularly attuned to using breakpoints and whatnot, even though recently, I didn't personally do this for a long time, but recently, one of the senior engineers in my company, he's really taught me the art and style of using breakpoints in code and how you can debug on runtime. But when I was a noob, a pleb, I used to just pretty much log everything and then debug while logging. That's probably not the best way to debug code, but I do know, I think a lot of programmers, especially plebs, I'm using that term rather fussily, but even, forgive me for being sardonic, but the point being, if you're an inexperienced, or even if you're an experienced programmer, it doesn't really matter, if you do log your code, log objects, log different properties, and put a lot of logs in your code, for debugging, you need what you log to give you meaningful information, and that's really important. So the problem though is it could be a component with reference to a given object that includes a string representation in a logged error message, which would be easy to debug with a meaningful ToString. So what I've written here is essentially it could probably be a class that refers to the object of your class, and if the ToString method is meaningless, then the client of that component is going to be disserviced, especially when it comes to debugging. So a quick example here would be if we take a look at this simple class that I created called myComponent, which, as you can see, is referring to the phone number class. When the myComponent class is constructed, in the constructor, it's instantiating a new phone number object. Let me actually do it like that, so it's better. And then if I run this, and I'm intentionally throwing an exception here, so let's say there was some kind of error, and in the error log, once the exception is caught, it's logging a meaningful string representation of the myComponent.phone number object. Now, of course, if we didn't override the ToString method, and if we had it by default as the hexadecimal, which it is, it would, in this case, make debugging a lot harder, because now you're not really sure what this class, you kind of do know what the class does, but it's better to always have a string representation, which is why Joshua Bloch states, providing a good ToString implementation makes your class much more pleasant to use and makes systems using the class easier to debug. The ToString method is automatically invoked when an object is passed to println, printf, the string concatenation operator or assert, or is printed by a debugger. Even if you never call ToString on an object, others may. So what he means by the others may is, of course, in this case, the myComponent class used the ToString method. So it's good to be charitable and think about others in that sense. And he continues, programmers will still generate diagnostic messages in this fashion whether or not you override ToString, but the messages won't be useful unless you do. Yes, it's kind of the same thing he's repeated there. Also, another sort of ancillary point, I guess, is that he said collections, in fact, make good use of the ToString method. So if you look at this demo, once again I have a hash map. Once again I have a hash map that uses the phone number class. So the key is of type string and the value is of type phone number. And we're adding this key called Zizek, my favorite philosopher, and a new object of phone number. So if I do print this, what you'll see is, in this case, this is a mistake actually. So it says here, Zizek, and it's printing the object, and this is kind of meaningless. But if we do override this ToString method, and reprint that and then print the elements in that collection. In this case, you can see there's only one element, but it says Zizek, and you get Zizek's phone number. This is not his phone number, but if it is, I would have called him and immediately asked him for an interview to nerd out on philosophy, but this is not his phone number, unfortunately. Okay, let's keep going. So he states here, or he continues, when practical, the ToString method should return all of the interesting information contained in the object, as shown in the phone number example. Then on this next point, where we discuss objects not conductive to string representation, he states, it is impractical if the object is large, so these are objects that is a bit harder to represent as a string. Why is this giving a typo to A? There we go. Sorry, he continues, it is impractical if the object is large or if it contains state that is not conductive to string representation. And then he continues before we get to the demo. Under these circumstances, so if the object is not conductive to a string representation, under these circumstances, ToString should return a summary of the class. Ideally, the string should be self-explanatory. So let's take a look at this demo. Over here, we have a class called phone directory. This class is, if you look at the ToString method of this class, which I'll show in a moment, it is a summary of this class. So what do I mean by that? This class has two fields, two private fields. It's got string name and a list of phone entry type called phone entries. And in the constructor, it'll set the values for these two fields. And if you look at phone entry, that's a class of its own, in fact, which is a inner class called phone entry. So that simply takes the full name and the phone number. That class really doesn't do that much. And then in the phone directory class, we have a list of phone entry, as I did already say. Then if you look at the ToString method, what this ToString method does is it returns the phone directory with the name. That's the name of whoever the person is. And then all it does is it returns phone entries .size. So it doesn't really return every single element in the phone entry list. Now, if you look at how a client might use the phone directory class, we have three objects here. We have phone entry 1, 2, and 3. Then we also have a phone entry list. So into the phone entry list, we've added, by the way, phone entry 1, 2, and 3. These three objects are of the type phone entry, and then the list is, of course, of type phone entry 2. And into the list, we add these phone entries. And afterwards, into the directory, which is of type phone directory, obviously, we add a name. In this case, they're the existentialists, and we add their names, character guide, nature start, into the phone entry list. Because, the phone entry list where we added these objects to are added into this, not added, but this phone directory class is instantiated with that list. Gosh, I'm butchering this simple thing. I'm sorry, it's been a long couple of days. My brain's gone a bit mush. So if you do run this, what you'll see is, yes, it's printing phone entry as it should, with the full name and the phone number. But if you look at the phone directory class, what it's really doing is it's saying existentialist and saying, okay, there are 3 existentialists in this phone directory. And that's kind of the point here. So it's not always necessary to represent every single thing in a class, especially if there are lists involved and other components involved in the class. What's important is, as Joshua Bloch states, the string should be self-explanatory. This ToString method that we've overridden in the phone directory class, this is still something meaningful in comparison to, let's say, a hexadecimal for a client of the phone directory class. So it's still of value. Again, the key term here is meaningful. The reason it's important for it to be meaningful is, again, if it comes to debugging here, if there's an assertion failure or there's a test failure, it'll say expected this, but was this. Now for a user or a programmer, this looks the same. So he or she doesn't know where the hell the error is. It's probably because in the string representation of this class, some significant field, something that would give meaning to this object, has been missed out. Therefore, the user is kind of blindsided and have to figure it out on their own. So it's probably always good to over-communicate and over-represent what an object is in a string. So of course, something you may have noticed in the phone number class is when we were representing the phone number, you could see here we did give it a certain format. We did represent it in a certain format. And that begs the question, how do we specify the format of the return value in documentation? Or to put it in Joshua Bloch's words, one important decision you'll have to make when implementing a ToString method is whether to specify the format of the return value in the documentation. So according to him, it's important to document the format for value classes, such as phone number or matrix. Now, what are value classes? So before we get to the demo, a bit of theory out of the way. So according to one definition I found by UC Berkeley, at a fundamental level, so I'm defining value classes here. At a fundamental level, value classes define objects which, once created, never change their value. A variable of a value type may only be changed by reassigning to that variable. When we wish to only modify some portion of a value class, one attribute, let's say, we're compelled to reassign the whole object. So something rather static, and I mean that conceptually, not in the Java sense, like that, probably it's okay to document that because it's not going to change. It's going to be invariable. And also another definition, I would say a clearer one, in fact, by ChatGPT. With a value class, this helps create a standardized human-readable representation of the object that can be used for input-output and persistent human-readable data objects. So if you look at this new variant of the phone number class, it is for all intents and purposes immutable. The reason is the class is final, all the fields are final, therefore it is going to be static. It'll not change. It is not mutable. And if you look at the ToString method, in this case, in the documentation, we have specified what the format of the string representation would be. And we've even given an example. And then if we go look at a client that'll use the phone number class and run this code, by the way, you can see here an object of phone number is created. The ToString method, what it returns, the representation, it maps or it corresponds to what's being specified in the documentation on the ToString method itself. So for a class like this, which is a value class, it's okay to document the format. It's okay to document the format, as Joshua Bloch states. So just to keep reading what is stated here, to put it a bit more formally, the advantage of specifying the format is that it serves as a standard, unambiguous, human-readable representation of the object. This representation can be used for input and output and in persistent human-readable data objects, such as CSV files. If you specify the format, it's usually a good idea to provide a matching static factory or constructor so programmers can easily translate back and forth between the object and its string representation. So I forgot to show that part. That's the ToString method here, where in this case, sorry, not the ToString method, I kind of got confused there. The FromString method, where it's doing the opposite. It's instead of converting the object to a string, it's taking a string and converting that to an object. So you could give, for example, this phone number class a string of with the proper format, and then that'll convert it to a phone number object. Now we can take a look at how that works. So if you look at this bit of code here, where the client's using the FromString method, this phone number string, which is printed here in line number 82, which you'll see is this, is passed to the FromString method that takes a string, and then that converts that or passes it to a type of phone number. Now, what's interesting here is if you do pass in something of a wrong format, like just some mess like that, this is going to throw an error. There you go. It'll throw an invalid format, invalid phone number error, or an illegal argument exception. That's good because if you want to convert this string to a phone number object, we want it to be of a certain type, of a certain format. And that's what this FromString method does. So the ToString and the FromString kind of interoperates. I was thinking of interpolates. In any case, it seems self-evident that the disadvantage of specifying the format is that it makes the code static. Again, conceptually speaking, because now when you have a format, you can't make the FromString method or the ToString method that dynamic once you document it and you say that this is how this object has to be represented. But that's a trade-off a programmer has to make. As Joshua Bloch states, programmers will write code to pass the representation, to generate it, and to embed it into persistent data. If you change the representation in a future release, you break their code and data, and they will yell. By choosing not to specify a format, you preserve the flexibility to add information or improve the format in a subsequent release. YAL is a funny word, and in fact, a lot of programmers tend to do that. But one way to hopefully not make programmers YAL as much is whether or not you decide to specify the format, you should clearly document your intention. So it's always important to over-communicate why you're doing what you're doing in your ToString method, which you'll see again in the example Joshua Bloch has provided. He has clearly documented what this ToString method does and why he's doing so, apropos the format. Of course, another important point to make this code more usable is provide programmatic access to the information contained in the value returned by ToString. So what does that mean? It simply means having really good getters in your class so that the programmer won't have to pass through your string or pass through the string returned from the ToString method to use those values as clients. Having such code where you don't provide good programmatic access to all the information, all the fields in your class will create error-prone code. If you've been coding for a while, you'd know that something that's absolutely painful is passing strings and trying to derive certain values from a string, especially given that it's highly dynamic and the code could change in the future or the format could change too. Therefore, using code or writing code that passes strings can create, as I said, highly volatile and or error-prone code. So the simple way to solve that, of course, is, as Joshua Bloch states, provide programmatic access. All these values can be returned or are returned in the ToString method. However, for the individual values, it's important to have getters. And if you look over here, the client can then easily just use get area code, get prefix, get line number, instead of passing through this string here returned by the ToString method. And in fact, Joshua Bloch has put it the best way possible. By failing to provide accessors, you turn the string format into a de facto API, even if you've specified that it's subject to change. Because if the programmer has no way of getting these values with a getter, then he or she will have to resort to using the ToString method despite it being subject to change. Also, when writing ToString methods, there are, of course, like all of programming and perhaps all of life, certain exceptions. There's no requirement to write or override the ToString method of the object class in Java for static utility classes, because you simply wouldn't be using the ToString method because you don't create objects with a static class. For enum types, because Java's 1 is perfect enough, it represents all the values in an enum perfectly as to how it's implemented in Java. But however, you should still write them for abstract classes. Because simply put, concrete classes are going to use abstract classes and they may use the ToString method in the abstract class. So if you look at this abstract class called shape, I have overridden the ToString method, and then we have some other concrete classes called class, square, that are extending the abstract class. And then if you run it, you'll see that it's using the ToString method inherited from the parent abstract class, and then it's printing out the area for the circle and square. So this is the reason that it's important still to write ToString methods for abstract classes. As he says here, you should, however, write ToString method in any abstract class whose subclasses share a common string representation. For example, the ToString methods on most collection implementations are inherited from the abstract collections class. That's correct. And then, of course, like the previous methods, he does state that it's probably a good idea then writing this ToString method on your own to use some kind of library or framework that's already available in the open source community. So, for example, he states here, Google's open source auto value facility discussed in item 10 will generate a ToString method for you, as will most IDEs. These methods are great for telling you the contents of each field, but aren't specialized to the meaning of the class. Interestingly, when I read that, I realized, oh, actually, maybe now you could just copy a code and put it in ChatGPT, and it'll obviously just create a meaningful ToString method. It can do things that are way more advanced than that. Something as simple as this, it'll easily do. So, yeah, you essentially don't have to ever really have spend a lot of time and mental energy writing ToString methods anymore. You could just use the tools available out there. Anyway, to finish it off, Joshua Bloch states, to recap, Override objects ToString implementation in every instantiable class you write, unless a superclass has already done so. It makes classes much more pleasant to use and aids in debugging. The ToString method should return a concise, useful description of the object in an aesthetically pleasing format. That's it. Quite a simple, straightforward item. Nonetheless, I wanted to go through it because it does help in writing good Java and, well, object-oriented code. Thank you for watching. I hope you got some value from that video. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.